So this is our second virtual IRP seminar. We're very excited to have Regina Baker with us today to talk about her work on family structure and race. We are setting this up as a webinar, which means that if you have a question along the way of clarification, you should go ahead and put that question in the Q&A or the chat. And I will go ahead and try and ask that question to her. If it's a substantive question, I'm going to suggest that you hold it. You can type it in as we go, but hold it to the end and I'll make sure it gets asked, or I'll invite you to ask it yourselves by giving you speaking power in the webinar room. With that, I just want to welcome Regina Baker. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. And our only regret is that she can't be with us here in person. So I am going to go ahead and hand it over to you, Regina. Take it away.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everybody for taking the time out your day to come to listen to my talk. I really appreciate this opportunity to share this new project with you. All right, so let's get started. All right, is it good? We're good?
You are great.
Okay. So this project is a new paper, The Legacy of Slavery and the Impact of Family Structure on Black-White Inequality and Poverty. And this paper is a collaboration with Heather O'Connell at Louisiana State University. And Heather is actually an alum of UW-Madison's sociology program. So I wanted to make sure to point that out. All right. So in terms of just this talk, I'm going to begin by providing some background and some lit review in terms of really understand, the foundations for the research questions in this and for this current study. And then I'm going to go into more detail in terms of what this study is actually doing. And because the study is divided into two separate analyses, I'm going to first go over the analyses and the methods and the results for the individual data, which is the analyses, which is the primary analyses. And then I'm going to go into separately the methods, analyses, results for our county level data. And then I'll wrap it up with some summary and conclusions, and then following with that implications. Okay, so this quote from sociologist Barbara Reston accurately summarized a pressing issue that continues to plague America. And that is, quote, "Today, in virtually every realm for which evidence exists, from the bottom to the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy, whites remain better off on average than Blacks." And one of the most pressing or enduring of these socioeconomic racial disparities is the disproportionate share of poor families that are Black. So despite the poverty measure that's used, whether you're using the official poverty measure, such as recent census report that just came out a month ago, or whether you're using advanced measures of poverty, a relative measure of poverty, or a supplemental poverty measure, regardless of what measure is being used, there's been consistency in the findings. And that is that Blacks are on average more likely to be poor than white, and then more specifically 2 times more likely to be poor. And this is consistent across measures. And these are I'm just pointing to a recent study that I had published with David Brady, Zachary Perilyn, and Dedrick Williams, where we look at poverty trends using improved measures of poverty, supplementary poverty measure, relative measure of poverty, counting for underreporting, finding these gaps that they endure. And again, even the census data, whether using the official poverty measure, we still see those gaps as well. For a visual, this figure is from a study by Sullivan and Seibert that came out earlier this year that focuses on the Black-white poverty gap in families with children. And it's nice to see over time, right? Again, they use 2 different poverty measures, the official poverty measure, as well as an anchored supplementary poverty measure. But what I want you to see here is just a visual of the gaps, right? And so the bottom, the blue line and the red line is white poverty, the green and purple on the top is Black poverty. And we see even though there was a narrowing of the gap, it's still double, right, in modern times. So when it comes to understanding these enduring racial differences in Black-white inequality and poverty, particularly focusing among families with children, both scholarship and policy have emphasized differences in family structure, right? And we think about the logic, right? It makes sense. So poverty rates are higher among single mother families relative to married parent families with children, right? And increases in single motherhood historically have tended to correspond with increases in child poverty. And among these single mother families, a disproportionate share of them are Black families. Thus, research has identified single motherhood as a mechanism for the reproduction of poverty that largely contributes to the Black-white poverty gap. As follows, there has been an emphasis on marriage and its economic benefits relative to single mother families, right? And if you're, for those, this is the Poverty Center, so I'm sure you know the literature to go to, but for those who might be watching this, I recommend the references I cite here, just for more detail in terms of just the extent to which marriage works as a benefit, right? But things such as, greater likelihood to have two earners in the household, the pooling of incomes, greater financial resources that come as a result of being married, right? And so these are all economic benefits of marriage. Hence, it's not surprising that as a result, poverty scholarship and policy debates have touted marriage as a solution for reducing poverty, right? And increasing economic stability among children, and thus effectively closing those racial gaps. But while a rich literature has examined the family structure, racial inequality, poverty link, relatively few studies have examined variation in the impact of family structure by race and ethnicity. And we argue this is a critical avenue of research because it challenges perspectives that treat marriage and structure as an entity that operates in marriage and family structure as an entity that operates independently of race and broader social institutions. So I now highlight some of the prior findings that demonstrate racial disparities and the socioeconomic impact of family structure. So for example, poverty rates are higher for single mother families than married families with children, yet rates remain higher for Black families than white families, despite having the same family structure. And a recent study that me and Dedrick Williams had that came out earlier this summer shows just that. Furthermore, even if Black women had similarly family backgrounds and similar rates of marriage and unwed childbearing as white women, their poverty rates would still be over 2 times as high. Marriage provides more material advantages for children, particularly white children, than Black children, as Manning and Brown find. And white women experience greater economic returns to marriage. So think in terms of, wealth generation over time, upward mobility. So all of these are white women experience as greater as a result of being married as compared to Black women. And so these findings challenge prevailing notions that specific behaviors such as getting married or avoiding non-marital childbearing will lead to similar improved outcomes across racialized groups. And so these disparate impacts of family structure for poverty really suggest that perhaps there are some broader structural forces at play. And the larger penalties for poverty risk, for example, among Blacks, me and Dedrick argue, they essentially reflect a long racist history in the US, right? And racial inequalities are manifestations of underlying historical processes, and family scholarship, we argue, could benefit from incorporating this perspective. But not all poverty research has maintained an emphasis on individual behavior. A growing body of work underscores the relevance of structural mechanisms for poverty. This work underscores the relevance of things such as macro scale institutions and how they're important because they help shape individual and collective behavior, right? So thinking about things such as, policies, safety nets, the labor market, and essentially these macro scale institutions, or think of them as, established rules, laws, and actions. They're salient because they do shape that individual and collective behavior. And this is a quote from David Brady that nicely captures that, right? So institutions reflect the residue of the power of collective actors in the past, and institutions continue to be consequential even without active maintenance by collective actors. And so we build on this literature by connecting it with research on the historical foundations of structural racism. So racism is deeply embedded in the various institutions of the past and present, right? So institutions, as Brady had said, reflect the residue of the past, and oppressive institutions in particular really demonstrate this great persistence in terms of their effects. And slavery is a prime example of such an oppressive institution that has had a lasting impact. Scholars have contended that slavery was a racialized state policy that served as an institutionalized mechanism of racial inequality. Not only was slavery a cruel institution of domination and exploitation, it really solidified social divisions that would continue to influence US race relations over time. And slavery also severely limited Black families' ability to generate income and accumulate wealth. Thus, the salience of the legacy of slavery for contemporary outcomes has been a growing interest in research. As a proxy for the legacy of slavery, studies have measured the historical concentration of enslaved people in 1860 to reflect the extent to which a place was reliant on enslaved labor. And this is suggestive of the extent to which the system of slavery was or is embedded in local contexts. Our growing literature has underscored the salience of the legacy of slavery for various contemporary outcomes. So for example, O'Connell demonstrates that the relationship between local slave concentration in 1860 is tied to Black and white inequality in Southern counties, independent of contemporary demographic and economic conditions, racialized wealth and racialized wealth disparities. Other scholars have demonstrated the relationship between the legacy of slavery and inequality and socioeconomic mobility, as well as the relationship between this legacy of slavery and better white economic gains. And so, as Williams argues, modern inequalities, especially racial inequalities, cannot really be fully understood without a knowledge of the historical processes that have impacted it. So while both the existing literature on poverty and families and the legacy of slavery literature have made valuable contributions to scholarship on racial inequality and poverty, new insights can be gained by integrating these two research areas. So for instance, one implication of research demonstrating variation in the economic economic returns, both positive and negative, to different family structures by race, is that racism shapes how family relates to wealth and poverty. However, we can provide more direct evidence on this point by assessing the extent to which indicators of structural racism, like the legacy of slavery, modify the link between family composition and poverty for Black and white households. So this brings us to our research question. To what extent does an indicator of structural racism, that is the legacy of slavery, modify the link between family structure, that is living in a single mother household or a married couple household with children, on the Black-white inequality and poverty? So for this research question, we formulated two hypotheses. So the first general hypothesis is that the legacy of slavery does modify the extent to which family structure differentially relates to poverty by race, to the disadvantage of Blacks and the advantage of whites. More specifically, we expect that single mother household poverty will be more closely related to race. That is, it's going to be more concentrated among Black households and places where there's a stronger contemporary legacy of slavery. And that is that the negative impact of being a single mother on one's economic position will be more pronounced and Black households than white households where this structural racism is stronger. And similarly, we expect the same for married. We expect the same benefits of marriage. Similarly, we expect the benefits of marriage to be enhanced for white individuals and less accessible for Blacks and a higher as compared to lower legacy of slavery contexts. But in contrast to our expectations, it is possible that the race differentials found in previous research are consistent across place, regardless of connection to the legacy of slavery, which is our hypothesis too. And under this scenario, we would expect a positive relationship between race and poverty among single mother and married households, but no interaction with the legacy of slavery. This would suggest the mechanisms producing enhanced disadvantage for Blacks among single mother households and reduced advantage among married families are not tied to this form of structural racism and may be more universal in nature. And so distinguishing between these two possibilities will provide critical guidance for future research and policy development by indicating the connection between family structure and structural racism when understanding economic outcomes. And so our results will suggest the relative emphasis that should be given to family structure itself and the structural mechanisms that shape the meaning of being a single mother and a married couple with child household. So in the analyses to follow, we assess the extent to which the legacy of slavery modifies the differential likelihood of poverty for Black and white households with the same family structure. So our research draws together the research on poverty and families and the legacy of slavery. And the literature on poverty and families has traditionally had an individual level focus, yet the legacy of slavery literature has taken a primarily county level place-based approach. Thus, we developed two sets of analyses based on these two research traditions, a multi-level analysis that links individuals and state level data and a county level analyses. And doing so helps us overcome the limitations available in each. So now turning to our individual level analyses. So for this analysis, we rely on data from the Luxembourg Income Study, also known as the LIST, which is a cross-national archive of historically harmonized national representative individual level data sets. And for the US, the LIST uses the March Current Population Survey, CPS. The LIST cleans the data and creates a new set of standardized variables. And the compelling advantage of the LIST under the underlying CPS is that it has high quality and significantly improved income measures and comprehensively incorporate taxes and transfers. And because we're interested in contemporary inequality, we focus on the waves 2015 and 2019, which corresponds with our data period for our county level data. And for the state level measure of slavery, we go to the historical US Census. So in terms of our sample, because we're focusing on Black and white individuals, we limit our samples to non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic Blacks that reside in the South, and as defined by the US Census. And here's a map of Southern states, because not everybody knows what states are in the South. There are some Southerners who don't even know all the states in the South, but Maryland, yes, Maryland and Delaware are part of the South. But these are the states that we're focusing on, but we exclude Oklahoma because there is no census data regarding the enslaved population in 1860 because it wasn't yet a state. And we also exclude Washington, DC, because it's an extreme and highly influential outlier in the state level analyses. While it does not have the same effect in the county level analyses, we exclude it there for consistency. And so this yields a total sample of individuals, slightly under 107,000 individuals, right? And then in our analyses, because we're focusing on family structure, we have the subsamples of individuals who reside in single mother-headed households, which is about 22,000, and then individuals, about 85,000 who reside in married-headed households with children. So in terms of our measures for the independent independent level analyses. Our dependent variable is poverty, or most are depending on the different analysis we use. So like when we do our bivariate analyses, we're interested in the black-white poverty gap. And we use a relative poverty measure. So individuals living in households with the post-tax, post-transfer disposable income. That includes like cash and non-cash income after tax and transfer, such as food stamps, housing allowances, tax credits, and near cash benefits. And so it's based on a threshold of 50% of the median. So anybody living in a household with income below that is categorized as poor. We equivalize our income measure, meaning we adjust for household size, right? And this disposable household income measure is a leading international standard for a comprehensive income, and thus making it a more reliable or improved measure than the standard official poverty measure. So in terms of our independent level variables, well, our key independent variables here are, what the enslaved population. So it's at the state level. So what's the enslaved population percent in 1860? Also, a key focal point of our analyses is the interaction between the enslaved population and Black, right? And so that's another key independent variable of ours. And other variables in the model include race, just Black, Black, right, with the preference, house composition. Because our analysis is divided by family structure, that's not included. We don't control for that, obviously, but thinking about house composition in terms of what are the number of children in a household, and are there adults over 65 in the household, things like that. We also control for the age of the head of household. We look at the education level of the head of household employment. So is it household unemployed? Is it a multiple earner household? Are there retirees in the household? We also look at the immigrant status. So is the head of household foreign born? And then we also look at whether or not the household is in a rural area. And then we also have controls for the year. So in terms of our analytic strategy for this part, our primary analyses, we have individuals nested in states, and after we present our descriptive findings, we have bivariate analyses at the state level. And so we look at that relationship between 1860 enslaved population and the Black-white poverty gap for each, those who live in single mother households, and those who live in married households with children. As stated above, we use a binary variable. Well, we use a binary variable to indicate a binary race variable to indicate the extent of inequality. Sorry, I don't want to confuse you. So that's the bivariate. I'm skipping. There's a bivariate analyses, right? Okay. And so then we employ, going ahead, a multi-level linear probability model, right, to examine that relationship even more closely between the legacy of slavery and Black-white inequality and poverty among single mother and married headed households, right? And as stated earlier, we have that interaction, right? And so we are able to look at the extent of inequality, net of other factors, and the interaction between that variable and the state level legacy of slavery variable, which will demonstrate how the legacy of slavery affects Black-white inequality. And so this interaction allows us to assess whether a stronger legacy of slavery at the state level exacerbates the differential connection between a given family type and poverty in that state, as indicated by a positive interaction coefficient. So our focus on the differential impact of family structure on poverty for Black and white families dependent on the extent of the legacy of slavery would ideally be addressed using a model that pulls all families and includes like a three-way interaction for family structure, race, and the legacy of slavery. However, due to the cumbersome nature of interpreting a three-way interaction, we have elected to use subsamples to achieve the same statistical end. And so the setup of our data with our use of family structure subsamples instead of race subsamples allows us to maintain a direct statistical test of differences by race, which we see as more fundamental to our argument than differences between family structures. And so our analysis could also be used to address whether the relationship between the legacy of slavery and racial inequality and poverty vary by family structure, but we focus more so on what the legacy of slavery relationship can tell us about why race and family structure combine differently when examining poverty. And also important to note, for both state level and county level, we tested the residual spatial autocorrelation, and our estimates appear to be unaffected by unobserved spatial processes. Okay, so now for our first set of results. So turning to some just descriptives, as expected, there are differences in poverty by race and family structure. The poverty rates for Black and white individuals in single mother-headed households are about 48% and 36% respectively. And these rates are higher than those living in married with children households, whose rates of poverty are about 14% and 8% respectively. While the Black-white poverty gap, 12.6, for individuals in single mother households is twice as high as those in married-headed households. It is still notable that a gap among those in married households exists at all, especially given the attention marriage receives when explaining poverty and poverty inequality in particular. Among those living in single mother-headed households, the Black-white poverty gap ranges from a high of about 21% in North Carolina and a low of about 5% in Kentucky. Among those in married-headed households with children, the Black-white poverty gaps are much smaller. Louisiana has the highest Black-white gap at about 13%, whereas North Carolina has the smallest gap, not even 1%. Okay, so this figure displays the state-level bivariate relationships between the enslaved population in 1860 and Black-white inequality and poverty among individuals living in single mother-headed households. So panel A is single mother households, and panel B are those who live in married households with children. So just at an overview in terms of, in contrasting these two scatter plots, there are a few things I want to note. So first, the Black-white inequality and poverty is higher among those living in single mother households than those living in married-headed households. So you can see here, this all is raised in terms of thinking about where they are on the graph, right? Second, there is greater variation in the levels of Black-white inequality among those in single mother households. And third, there is a positive linear association between the proportion of the population enslaved and Black and white inequality for both family types. But let's look at each one more closely. So to the third point, a higher concentration of enslaved people in 1860 is associated with higher Black-white inequality for both samples, right? So here, looking at those who live in single mother households. Overall, there is even though it's a positive relationship, it's a rather weak positive relationship, right? In terms of that linear relationship. And in terms of some things that's going on, so some states with the highest enslaved populations, such as Mississippi and South Carolina, also have rather high Black-white poverty gaps, right? And then some of have the high poverty gaps. Yet some states with relatively smaller enslaved populations, such as Delaware and West Virginia, have larger Black-white poverty gaps than states such as Alabama and Virginia, which are in the middle when it comes to the enslaved population, right? And so while some patterns seem to make sense, other ones are not as clear. Among those in married households with children, there is a moderate positive association between enslaved population in 1860 and Black-white inequality, contemporary Black-white inequality and poverty. States with a higher enslaved population tend to have relatively high inequality and poverty, such as Louisiana and South Carolina, whereas states with lower enslaved populations tend to have lower Black-white inequality, such as West Virginia and Delaware and Maryland. However, North Carolina stands out for having middling slavery rates, but the lowest inequality among those in married households with children, as compared to the highest inequality among those in single married households, as I pointed out in the last slide. So overall, when it comes to the relationship between historical enslaved concentration and Black-white inequality and poverty, these bivariate associations suggest that the legacy of slavery might be more consequential for Black-white inequality in married families than for single mother families. And the implication of this is that marriage may not be as protective for Black households as it is for white households, and this gap is more pronounced where the legacy of slavery is stronger. And so to further scrutinize this relationship between the legacy of slavery and poverty among Black and white Southerners illustrated in these bivariate analyses, we turn to our multi-level linear probability models to test whether historical concentration of enslaved people in 1860 is significantly associated with poverty today. So this table displays the LPM linear probability results. Our primary focus here is the interaction between the historical concentration of enslaved people in the subsample in the race variable. And this indicates whether the legacy of slavery increases the probability of poverty for Black individuals. And so the base model 1 includes only the enslaved population, the interaction, the race of the individual, and all the year controls. So across both samples, the results indicate that the total enslaved population is not a significant predictor of poverty for white populations, as indicated by the null main effect for the legacy of slavery variable. The interaction between the total enslaved population and being Black is positively assigned for both samples. However, consistent with the state level bivariate results, the interaction is not statistically significant for those living in single mother households, yet it is significant for those living in married with children households. So model 2 tests the interaction of historical concentration of enslaved people and being Black when including all the other independent variables in the model. The main effect for enslaved population remains non-significant across models, meaning that white individuals in either sample do not suffer any additional penalty for residing in a state with a stronger legacy of slavery. And model 2 tests the interaction of historical concentration of enslaved people and being Black when including all the independent variables in the model. Among those in single mother-headed households, there is still no evidence of an interaction between historical enslaved population and being Black. However, among those in married-headed households, the interaction remains statistically significant. But the interaction remains for individuals living in married-headed households with children. So these results essentially indicate that living in a state with a higher concentration of enslaved people elevates the probability of poverty for Black individuals living in married-headed households with children, but this is not the case for individuals living in single mother-headed households.
Regina, can I ask a question?
Yes.
It's one of those. But the coefficients look exactly the same, but it's the sample sizes that are drastically different. So how should I think about them being different if, in fact, they're the same, but just differentially, like differences in precision rather than magnitude?
Well, I guess more so it's just the fact that like when we have I guess we'll say two things. Just thinking about the analyses or the results in totality. So thinking about along with what we saw in like the bivariate analyses, right? Just like in suggesting that there's this, we saw the stronger association for the those who live in, married households than single, as long as I get mixed up, right? And then when we get to the county level analyses next, right? So just taking it all in totality in and of itself, right? You might be like, okay, wondering what about those numbers, but then just taking it all together, I think that's where the story is, right? Because it's other evidence and these other analyses as well that suggest that there's something might be going on there.
Okay. Those numbers look similar to me. That's all.
Okay. Let's see, where was I? So this suggests that the legacy of slavery exacerbates Black, white inequality and poverty, but primarily for individuals in married-headed households. Moreover, this result is not explained by the proximate determinants of poverty included in the model, suggesting that this legacy of slavery disadvantages Black families through more subtle means. Okay, so now turning to our next set of analyses, the supplemental analyses using the county level analyses. So we rely on county level data from the ACS for this portion of the analyses, and we use for this portion analyses, and the decennial census estimates stopped including information on poverty status among other social outcomes after the year 2000. So despite the limitations of the ACS, it is our best available source for aggregate estimates of Black, white poverty and inequality. And in order to cover all counties in the US South, regardless of population size, we use the 5-year period estimates for 2015 to 2019. And these were the most recent estimates at the time for our analyses. And this is also the same time period that we use for the individual level data. And so there are historical data. So we just like our other sample individuals, we had state slavery data, but this is all counties, and so we use county level slavery data at the county level, and we use the historical census for that. Okay, so we limit our sample to non-Hispanic, white, and Black individuals residing in the South, as defined by the US Census. Again, we exclude Oklahoma and DC. And this yields 1,075 Southern counties for our single mother household analyses, and 1,087 counties for our married with children analyses. And I think I might have noted before, we also, because we want to mirror the other analyses, we exclude Oklahoma and DC. DC doesn't prove to be an outlier in this particular sample, but we exclude it for consistency. But given all the counties that are included, that makes sense when we think about that. So counties, like, one advantage of this, county level data is that they give us more fine-grained information, because in the state level data, right, in state level analyses, states are not monolithic, right? You can take Virginia, for example. Rural parts of Virginia are very different than Northern Virginia, right? That's closer to DC. So we want to be able to capture that variation that's across states, right? To just really see what's going on when you think about place context. In addition, counties are also good units of analysis because they are associated with socio-political structures that are relevant to understanding racial and family dynamics, and capture potentially important sub-state variations in the historical attachment to slavery. So here for our measures and our county level analyses, our dependent variable is this county level Black, white inequality and poverty by family type, right? And so it's the number of poor single mother households relative to those number of single mother households for Blacks and whites. Separately, and we do the same for married households with children, married couple households with children. And we estimate county level poverty using the official poverty measure. There are various numerous limitations of the official poverty measure, which is why we don't use it in the individual level analyses. But unfortunately, this is like the best available measure of economic insecurity for our purposes. Even though alternative measures of poverty are available at the county level, they're not available by race and by family structure, which are the key, factors in our study. But fortunately, our primary analysis relies on a more comprehensive poverty measure. So the combination of our two analyses provides more complete coverage against the limitations of our available data. And so county level Black, white inequality and poverty by family. So I think I told you that. Yeah, so yes, we do. And our independent variable, again, is slavery, or more so the total of the enslaved population, the percent of the enslaved population in a county in 1860. So our focus here in our county level analyses is on the extent to which the legacy of slavery relates, or given our focus, we are, ideally our analyses would have covariates, right? Just like original, but unfortunately, there are no variables available at the county level that parallel our individual covariates and our primary analyses, right? So for example, we could include Black and white employment rates, but not the employment rates of Black and white families of different family structures, right? And so the consequence is that this portion of our analyses will demonstrate the overall relationship without accounting for potential mediating outcomes. And so we use correlation coefficients with tests for statistical significance to assess this relationship, right? Fortunately, our setup of the data, namely our use of concentration measure of poverty and subsamples for family type, mimics the interaction used in the individual level analysis that we can focus exclusively on the binary relationship without needing to use an interaction directly. And so we estimate one for Black, white inequality and the concentration of poverty among those in female-headed households, or not female-headed, single mother households, and one for the concentration of poverty among those in married households with children. And then we supplement these statistical estimates with maps of each dependent variable, because if we're doing strictly county level, it's nice to see variation in what's happening that way visually. So reflecting our individual level analyses, our county level analyses show single mother households with children headed by Black women are at a greater economic disadvantage than those single mother households that are headed by white women. The average percentage of single mother families that are considered to be poor using the official poverty measure is 48% for Black, and for whites is 40%. Both rates are high, but the economic consequences associated with being in a single mother household are more pronounced for families headed by Black women than for white women. And the county average for their concentration of poverty among those in married households with kids is 12% when the household is Black, and only 8% when the household head is white. The average county level difference in the concentration of poverty for Southern counties is 10 percentage points, suggesting white advantage, Black disadvantage on this outcome is a dominant trend in the region. While there's also substantial variation across counties and the poverty gap among married-headed households with children, the average county level inequality is only 5 or 6 percentage points to the advantage of whites compared to the 10% for single mother household.
Can I ask a real quick question? Back on the last slide. And so should we think about the fact that the gaps are, the average gap is larger than the 8 percentage point difference you're showing us as relevant for where people are, the dispersion of people across counties or the concentration of people within counties? Is that how we should think about those differences?
Can you say that again?
Sorry, just noting, right, that it's 8 percentage points and just if you look straight level without respect to within county, but then 10 if you look within county. So should we think about that as a difference that comes from where the dispersion of people across counties, or the concentration, flip side, of people within particular counties?
It would be the dispersion of people, the first one.
Okay, just,
so.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I could check. I got that Heather, because Heather, like county level, the Heather's saying she might be the best one to answer that question, but I think that's correct for how you interpreted it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
All right. Okay, no problem. All right. So some maps. So in contrast to our expectations, we continue to find that there's no evidence that the differential disadvantage associated with single mother households is related to the county level manifestations of the legacy of slavery. And so the binary correlation between our measure of racial inequality and poverty concentration among single mother families and the historical concentration of enslaved people in 1860 is null, with an estimate of negative 0.002, that's not significant. And the map figure provides some insight into this null relationship. So this map illustrates the level of Black-white inequality and poverty among single mother households in the South, right? And we see that for the legend, we see that the yellow and the orange, right? So those are actually negative, right? And so in those cases, we don't see higher Black poverty we don't see higher Black poverty among the group than whites. And that's because, depending on when you look at counties, there's some counties where there might only literally be 1 or 2 Black people in the county, right? And that one white person might be one thing, right? And so that's why we see those negative values when we see those. But the orange and the red are what we're really interested in, right? And so these are places where we see that Black white inequality for single mothers. And so if you look here, we see the red and orange, right? And the red areas, orange, have the highest inequalities, and the level of racial inequality is relatively consistent across counties, right? And this suggests there's little spatial variation to be explained by the legacy of slavery or any other county level factor. The level of racial inequality is relatively consistent across counties. That suggests that there's little, like I said, spatial variation. So in other words, the structural advantage associated with lower poverty among white single mother families is pretty pervasive across place. The degree of county level racial inequality and the experience of poverty is less pronounced for married couple households with kids than for single mother families, but the spatial patterning is more defined, suggesting systematic variation in the observed inequality that may be related to the structural explanations of poverty. So consistent with our individual level analyses that employs a state level context, here we find racial inequality and poverty, in married family, in those in the married families with children, is positively related to the historical concentration of enslaved, right? This correlation is statistically significant from 0. And so this further suggests that the protective effect of being in a married household that we hear all about is not equally shared by Black and white-headed households. Moreover, the greater advantage enjoyed by white individuals is more pronounced in some places than others, namely those places that have those stronger connections to the exploitative systems of slavery. And results here, they indicate that this racism, structural racism, legacy of slavery that's associated with the legacy of slavery could enhance the benefits of marriage for white individuals while dampening those for their Black counterparts. And so our county level correlations are a nice complement to our findings from the primary individual level analyses by confirming that the relationships identified there, even when we include controls, persist when we use a more refined geographical scale. Okay, so now in conclusion. So first, just to summarize, because I know there's a lot of information to the analyses. So basically with this study, we assessed the extent to which an indicator of structural racism, the legacy of slavery, modified that link between family structure and poverty for Black and white households. We uniquely employed multi-level analyses linking individual and state level data and a separate level analysis to examine how a proxy of the legacy of slavery, the historical concentration of the enslaved population in 1860, impacts the racial inequality and poverty by family structure, mainly thinking about those living in a single mother household versus a married household with children. We considered 2 hypotheses. The first being that this legacy of slavery actually modifies the extent to which family structure differentially relates to poverty by race. And our second hypothesis was that race differentials in poverty are consistent across place, regardless of what the connections to the legacy of slavery in a place. So to summarize the key findings, in both our primary analyses that examined the multi-level data of individuals nested in states And in our county level analyses, descriptive results are consistent with prior research and indicate Black poverty is higher than white poverty, regardless of family type. However, our additional analyses suggest a role of structural racism tied to the legacy of slavery, even when considering why family composition relates to different odds of poverty. So our primary individual analyses and the county level associations provide some evidence to support our hypotheses one. However, only when considering the race differentials in how marriage relates to poverty. The legacy of slavery significantly increases the exposure of Black married couple households with kids to poverty. The fact that this is not also the case when examining poverty among single mother households provides partial support for our hypothesis too. And this suggests that the mechanisms stemming from the legacy of slavery that affect how family structure relates to poverty may also be unique to the relative advantages that are associated with marriage. So just to further discuss some of these findings. So we found that the legacy of slavery does not appear to exacerbate the Black-white poverty gap among single mother households. But instead, the county spatial pattern suggests that Black single mother households experience uniform disadvantage across counties in the South relative to white single mother families. And this is irrespective of the local ties to slavery. And while we expected to find the legacy of slavery would modify the relationship between racial, like family structure and racial inequality and poverty among married households, we did not necessarily expect this relationship would be stronger than for single mother households. And this is contrary to what we expected, given the well-documented disadvantage associated with single mother households, especially relative to married households, who have greater financial resources and economic benefits. There's actually even a study by Berger and DeMarco in 2018 where he concluded that the most important correlate for worse mobility outcomes today are the fragile family structures, i.e. lower marriage rates and larger share of children living in single parent households in areas with higher concentrations of enslaved people. But our findings are in contrast with that. However, the fact that our results suggest that the legacy of slavery has a stronger impact for Black-white inequality among married families is consistent with recent research that demonstrates that marriage does not operate as the same protective mechanism against adverse socioeconomic outcomes across racialized groups. Moreover, in fact, Robert Rees, for example, in 2020 Social Problems article, found that white individuals experience better socioeconomic outcomes when living in counties with stronger legacy, like legacy context of slavery, so in areas with higher concentration of slavery in 1860. And so while white families in these areas experience benefits from this structural racism, which stems from the legacy of slavery, Black families concurrently experience reduced benefits in the same settings, but particularly when it comes to the benefits of marriage. So in some, there are two different set of analyses, or individual level analyses employing a state level context, and our county level analyses, each with their own strengths and limitations, yield similar conclusions, provides evidence that the legacy of slavery operates differently by family structure to impact poverty in households. And these findings suggest that the link between family structure and poverty is not direct, right? And so just based on all the emphasis that we hear, this idea that, okay, if you just get these people married or they just wait to do this, then it's gonna lead to this, right? But we show that this is not necessarily the case because you have to take into account your context, because context matters, right? And so what works in one context might not work in another context. And here we look specifically at the context of historical racism, right? And those ties to the legacy of slavery and how that affects that relationship. Third takeaway is that local manifestations of structural racism are part of how family structure matters for poverty and equality, which is also important to consider. So our study has implications for research on the relationship between family structure and poverty, and racial inequality and poverty, as well as just poverty policy, right? It adds to the growing evidence of a contemporary legacy of slavery that this growing rich literature has found, right? And we also provide further evidence demonstrating poverty research can really gain some useful insights and really understand, these inequalities in a more deeper way by focusing more attention to structural mechanisms of inequality, such as those associated with historical contexts. Our study also challenges the perceived, the implicit belief that marriage is an anti-poverty mechanism that works equally across groups and contexts, right? And so when marriage is touted as a solution, there's this implicit idea that it's just going to work for everybody, right? But just this growing literature that shows, wait a second, we don't see the same outcomes for everybody. We see this racial variation. And so this is just further research to add to that growing important literature that pushes back on that that popular argument. And finally, this study illustrates not finally, because I have one more implication slide, but this study also challenges the I'm going to be able to try next slide. Yeah. In addition, we just studied in terms of thinking about the utility of identifying how different institutional mechanisms matter and how they interact with family structure to obtain a fuller understanding of the mechanisms that lead to different family compositions experiencing greater likelihoods of living in poverty, right? And for us, specifically thinking about, married headed households and, those who are in areas where ties are stronger to slavery, we see that exacerbates those gaps. So in sum, what we want to underscore here is that when it comes to thinking about, poverty and these enduring racial inequalities, it's not just simply that single mothers and married families are just all on their own, just creating, poverty and relative advantage through their actions, and that's all that matters, right? We must also consider, the context, particularly the racist context in which people reside. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with a question from Tim Smeating, who you may know from his LIS life prior to coming to UW. And he asks, are your single parent families in the LIS women and kids living alone or unmarried women with children? The latter is everyone, but married couples. And we can, of course, unmute him if that question doesn't make sense.
So for this, it's strictly just married single mothers looking with single mothers, just all single mothers, unmarried single mothers. So we didn't differentiate whether or not they're cohabiting or not. So it's just single mothers versus unmarried for that. So that might be interesting to try. I know our samples are getting smaller. Just gotta know that single mothers who live alone without cohabiting partner are very, it's different context, right, to think about. Sorry, hold on. I just knocked out my earphone. Sorry about that. And because Tim, when I presented a paper at PA a couple of years ago, another paper on single motherhood, and he had the same question for the paper we were doing, and we, added analyses where we did that. So thank you for that question. That's something that we can think about. I have to ask, I guess it could be done too at the county level, but yeah, we didn't do it that way. But thanks for reminding me about that, because the context is different. But I guess I'd be curious to see if that, the relationship or the associations are even stronger when we do that as well, because then you wouldn't even have those, potential extra earners in the household as well. But thank you for that question and reminder, Tim.
And then we have a question from Nita, which is not dissimilar from a question I might have asked, but Can you talk a bit more about how you think about the link between the percentage of enslaved population and the legacy of slavery? Why is a higher percentage of enslaved population an indicator of a stronger legacy of slavery? Is it because there may be more descendants of slaves in these states, and that has some bearing? And you might say county, right? Because it's not just states, but is it because there may be more descendants of slaves in these states and or counties, or that has some bearing of current day racial disparities, and or it means that the institutions and laws were more discriminatory in places with a higher percentage of slaves? Does this imply that there's a lot of questions here, Anita. Does this imply that institutions were less discriminatory in places with lower percentage of slaves? That actually is not similar to the question I was going to ask. It's a better question, probably.
Okay. Well, one question is, can you like say these questions for me later, because that's a lot to get in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot. I know there's a lot in there. Okay, check out what part. So, I was going to say all of the above until another part of the question was asked, because there was different ones. But like, for example, when it comes to the legacy of slavery and why that's in, so to make it to understand, right? So the question was, why do we think that the legacy of slavery related to, or higher legacy of slavery related to higher racial inequality, right? So that's
so why higher percent enslaved, are you thinking about it as descendants of slaves or different policies? Like, what is the link between the percentage and the
well, I think it's like I think for that, all of that, right? So you think about, that all, like, this is like, so I could go so many directions for this question. I don't know, it's like going off so one thing is like, definitely thinking about like just the local ties and what that means, right? Legacy of slavery and what that means for, just the, race relations and inherent discrimination and just long-term oppression that's in the place where slavery was higher, right? And so I didn't present on this paper. It's another paper that I have. It's just waiting to hear about conditionally accepted. So I'm waiting to hear the final decision, but it's a paper I'm really excited about because I look at, I basically conceive of this notion of the historical racial regime. And so I don't just look at slavery, but I also look at Jim Crow. And so thinking about segregation, right? And like Black sharecropping and what's the other, voter disenfranchisement, right? And so all these things matter. And in places that had higher levels of slavery, we see these things are even worse, right? And so not in this presentation, because I wasn't focusing on this stuff, but like, if you look at the states, right? And like states where that have these stronger historical racial regimes where all these things matter, it's like the Deep South states, right? Where slavery was the highest, right? And so we think about how these ideas are just embedded in the fabric of these communities, right? And like, fast forward over time, they just don't, go away. It's kind of like earlier in the presentation when I was talking about like institutions and how they're like embedded. And even though collective actors who were like actively maintained it at the time might be gone, this stuff still lingers on, right? And it still impacts, right? And thinking about just policies that were put in place, right? And historically, and like, you can go on. I was thinking about that particular paper, and like in my discussion section, how I talk about all these, contemporary mechanisms through which historical racial regimes operate, right? You think about the criminal justice system, for example, and you think about, the racialized welfare state. For example, you have to talk about education, right? And so, being an area, like the research showing that the areas that had segregation and high level segregation in schools, and what does that mean for, just thinking about your ability to get a good education and get a job and accumulate wealth. And so all these things matter. And on that point, just thinking about how, the legacy of slavery is important. So like in my work, and I talk about how, when there's policies, when, Social Security like first started, right? And how like the people who benefited from those were primarily white individuals because there was exclusions, right? If you were a domestic worker or agricultural worker. And so those, when slavery was abolished, and then sharecropping essentially replaced that system in the South, right? And many former slaves became sharecroppers, right? And so you think about when you have these new policies, we're like, oh, we have some social benefits, but if you were an agricultural worker, you can't get them, or if you were a domestic worker, you can't get them. And if you were somebody who was a former slave, right, or family former slave, and are used to domestic work or agriculture work, they're not even benefiting from this, right? And we can see how like the ability to accumulate wealth early on, and that matters. We know from research that that matters over time. And so these are just like one of many things. I could go on and on and on on this. You got me going, excited for this stuff. Why this essentially matters for today, right? So that definitely matters. And then the first point I'm thinking about just the area, right? And so even the area, if you have families who weren't able to, they didn't migrate, you just families who are here long term, right? You think about some of these areas, like some of the poorest areas, like the rural Mississippi, for example, Mississippi Delta, people who've been there for generations, who are descendants of slaves, right? And on the flip side, you think about this kind of ties to my finding in terms of, or our finding in terms of why you see this stronger relationship for marriage. You think about if you're in the South, right, and you think about if you're white and married in the South, we already know just from research that there's selection into the marriage. People who have money, people who have education are more likely to get married. And so you think about those people in the South, and if you're white, what is your history? Your history, and are you more likely to have ties to old money, for example? And old money is in the areas with higher legacies of slavery. And so I could go on and on. It's like an entangled web.
Let me stop you just so we can get a few more questions in.
Yeah.
So Sarah Halpern-Meekin wants to know, she says, if we could identify some of the mechanisms through which a larger proportion of people were held in slaves in 1860 affect poverty rates today, what would you anticipate to see if you looked at northern states?
Right now, can you say that again?
So Sarah's saying, what would you expect to see in northern states if you did this study in northern states?
Given that, like I'm saying with slavery, like in northern states, I'm not even sure how that, it seems like you'd have to think of another, unless you were thinking about looking at whether like slavery not having it at all versus the South, is that what you mean? Or thinking about another mechanism in place of slavery? Trying to picture.
Okay, we'll come back to that. I'll have to
okay
for that one.
Okay.
So Marcy Carlson says, great to see you, Regina. Thanks for a great talk. Could you talk about selection into marriage? You just touched on this a little bit, and how that might factor into your interpretation of the Black-white poverty gap for married couples?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly that. So just thinking about, again, like I said, just touching on that, right? We know that those who have higher levels of education, have higher incomes, and are more likely to be married. And I think that's important when we think about, because when we think about the Black-white inequality gap, and we think about looking at levels. So we know that, well, not everybody knows, but for example, increased level, like the higher we go in terms of education, the wider we see like income gaps and Black-white gaps, right? So even though having a bachelor's or professional degree, doctorate degree is better for a Black individual compared to like one who does not, but when you compare them to those at the opposite end, right, with whites, right, who are then, it's even like the gaps just getting even wider and wider and wider, right? And so we think about like that matters, right? We think about selection into marriage, right? And so we just, at the face of it, we have that to think about as well. But then then we think about the context of which they're in, how those gaps might be more exacerbated in these areas, particularly, as I've said, like alluded to earlier, having whites who are more advantaged in these areas. And so like the work of Robert Rees showing, where its legacy of slavery is stronger, the concentration is higher past slaves, and finding that whites in those areas experience greater economic gains in terms of like income and, income, education, so different things like they benefit from being in these spaces. And so I think when you combine that, like, what the context, what happened in the context of what that means on top of this election effect, I think it just helps even exacerbate everything and just help us even understand it even more. So I think that definitely matters and is part of the story. But thank you for that question.
Sarah can unmute herself and ask
Okay.
a question. Go
Thank
for it,
you.
Sarah.
Thanks, Catherine. Thanks for the talk. This is really interesting. So what I was getting at is, I know you can't look in the northern states at proportion of people who were held as slaves in 1860.
Yes.
But I'm, like you were talking about before, there are presumably some mechanisms through which that, through which that measure is affecting poverty risk today. And so if we could identify those mechanisms and then look at them across states, I'm wondering what you would anticipate we would see in the North. And I'm thinking about that in part because, we know that the historical legacy of slavery is certainly not confined to the South, right? And so just thinking about how it reaches beyond its geographic borders.
Yeah. So great question. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. Now I can answer that. So again, I actually talked about this in another paper where I talked about like, okay, we find these trends in the South, but this idea of like, it wasn't just the South that was racist, right? And there's this idea of like, for example, the Jim Crow North, right? And things that were happening, thinking about, housing and education and segregation and redlining. And so these things that are happening in the North as well, right? And how these, some of these same ideals or the same, what's the word I'm looking for, perspectives that white Southerners had. There are many Northerners or, just Northerners broadly, but like people in the West, North, who had the same type of, share the same perspectives, right? And in terms of thinking about race. And I think that what I say in the paper is that, moving beyond the South, I think if we can identify these mechanisms, right, to basically, I would expect to find that these mechanisms are work at other places as well, right? And just, and there's some work being done to kind of expanding beyond the South, right? And so like thinking about Heather O'Connell's work in like sundown towns, right? And not in the South, right? And so finding like those areas are areas with like higher Black-white inequality and income inequality, greater poverty, and those weren't the South, right? Or the fact that I think it was Martin Ruff's work where he looks at like these organizational level like segregation, what do they call them? Like state level, what do you call them? Not laws, like I guess laws, but like, for example, you might have like segregation restriction in terms of like using certain things beyond the South, like in I think California was one. It's just places that you wouldn't necessarily think of, but like there's data. It's just you just have a matter of finding it and digging for it. But we know redlining happens everywhere, and so I think it's a matter of just identifying those mechanisms. And I think once you do, and you look at the inequality in those places, I would think that we would find similar relationships as well, right? The areas where those mechanisms are stronger, we would see inequality across the board because the racism in America, the oppression of, certain groups in America isn't confined to the South, right? And I think it's just a matter of identifying those mechanisms because they're there and just doing that analysis to dig deep because it's to me, it's present everywhere, right? It's just that for the purpose of this, South is just easy to, because it's so, it's so clear in the South and those measures are there, but I think that the same things are in play because we're thinking about the U.S. and how, the fabric of our country and how these ideals, ripple effect everywhere. And so I think that they would be present in the North as well. Long-winded way to answer your question, but hopefully that got at that.
So this is my own question. So the contrast between single parent families versus married parent families, right? So there's the marriage part of it. And then as Tim's question implied, there's the male, the male earner part of it potentially. So I realize that marriage, thank God, is no longer just a male-female thing. But largely when you're looking at the population level, that's sort of what you're talking about. So I'm wondering the extent to which you could investigate mechanisms and, for example, look at links to, I'm thinking specifically of men's economic status, Black versus white men's economic status in these counties, understanding that their economic status is not a reflection on their individual education or worth, but also on the discriminatory structures. So I'm not trying to take it away from a structural story,
Sure.
but maybe suggest one mechanism of discrimination in labor markets that might be operating to explain it.
I think you're onto something there. The labor market, I didn't mention it, but that's another mechanism that I say is a way that, this legacy of slavery operates as well. I think about early on exclusions and how that just impacts just long-term discrimination in the labor market labor market. I think that is, I think that, thanks for the suggestion. I think that's definitely would give us some additional information as well. And on that labor market point, like a new paper that's really early stages, it's not a paper yet, but a paper idea that me and colleague, Pilar Gonzalez-Pons, who's also a Wisconsin grad, and we're working on looking at the black and white, but like the legacy of slavery. We're not necessarily slavery, we're actually using my historical race regime measure, what expands beyond slavery to include Jim Crow. But looking at that and thinking about like wage inequality and gender, and so that's something, just because there's so much to do with it. And, we're interested in how basically, we see that through this study and in my other study that like something's happening, but like what are the mechanisms, being able to pinpoint them. And so like my current and future research is trying to do just that, think about the ways, this works, this question of, okay, we know that there's this legacy, but how does it really operate, right? And so really just trying to dig deeper on that.
We have one last question, which maybe is easy, but maybe not. Can you talk through again why, and this is from Isabel, can you talk through again why you chose to measure at the county level? Specifically, do you think that the county level measures may be masking disadvantage or poverty measures because they can sometimes vary widely across an individual county? So she wants to hear more about the county choice.
Why choosing county? Yeah. So the reason why we chose county and not just didn't do it is because states, they're exactly like there's so much variation in a state. Right? You might have a state that had high level of slavery in one county and none, in another, right? And so we want to make sure we capture that variation because different things are happening, right? No state, things are totally different across states. Things are happening. You might have pockets where more educated people live here, and maybe this, and that might be tied to the historical past there, but we can't capture that. We just look at the state level. And so this is why counties are just so important. And just thinking about the variation that's happening across state, and just thinking about the things that are happening at the county level and decisions that are made, and how that can vary so much within a state context as well. And so for us, it's like that's important. And so that's why I thought it was just a nice combination to have both the different analyses, the individual and state level, and then the county, to just create a stronger story because there's limitations of them both. But I think with the fine-tuned or the finer grain analyses or information you can get just across places is important to think about, because people who know me, I'm like all about place matters, place context matters. And in order to really truly understand, you can't just forget about, you can't say, place, because there's no one size fits all solution, as in politics, there's no one size solution, which is why we still see state policies, but we see there still might be areas of the state where poverty has been persistent for decades because not one size fits all. It's very different, and historical context is part of that reason. So,
well, Regina, I want to give you a chance to catch your breath. Thank you for this talk. We really appreciated it. And again, our only regret is that you weren't able to be here in person. As you can see, we would have had great conversations. So we'll look forward to inviting you back, at some point when this darn pandemic is over. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I did gather the questions from the chat.
Great.
And we'll email those to you directly.
Thank you.
It might be a little scattershot, but I think you got the gist of what he was saying.
Cool. Thank you. That'd be awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, again.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.